Installing Citrix Metaframe XP. Now before we go ahead and install Citrix Metaframe XP with Feature Release 3 on our server, there's a few prerequisite steps that we need to take. The first thing we should do is patch our server with any critical Windows updates that might exist for Windows 2003. Now you can do this by clicking on Start, All Programs, and then running Windows Update. Now you should also install any service packs that are available for your operating system. Now this time there aren't any service packs available for Windows Server 2003, but this might have changed when you install your Citrix server, so keep this in mind. Now the final thing we've got to do is we have to install terminal services. As Citrix Metaframe is an add-on to Microsoft Terminal Services, we need to make sure that Terminal Services is installed before we install our Citrix Metaframe XP. So to do this, we'll need to go to our control panel, and then we'll click on Add or Remove Programs. And then we'll come down here and we'll choose Add Remove Windows Components. Now we'll scroll all the way down the bottom here and we'll select Terminal Server. Now our demonstration server here is a Windows 2003 domain controller, so we'll choose to install our terminal server licensing here as well. Now if you are running an Active Directory domain, you should install the terminal server licensing option on a domain controller. If you're running in workgroup mode, which is probably unlikely, but then you'll actually install your terminal server licensing on any computer. So we'll just select both of these and then we'll click on Next. Next we get a message telling us that to enable regular users to use our terminal server, we'll need to add them to the remote desktop users group. And also any applications that we might already have installed on our server might not work. So with that in mind, we'll click Next, and then we'll have to select the mode of security that we'd like to use for our terminal server. Now we can use full security, which is the default option. Now this is quite obviously the best option as far as security is concerned, but earlier applications might have some problems, so do bear this in mind if you are going to run old applications on your terminal server. Now if you do experience any problems, you can always change this later, so we'll just leave the default and we'll choose Next. Now we can decide whether our licensing server is going to be made available to our entire enterprise or just our domain or our workgroup. Now in our case here we only have the one domain, so it really doesn't matter which option we choose, but in your case if you're managing multiple domains you might want to choose the first option. But of course if you are running several domains in your enterprise and you only want this licensing server to manage this particular domain, then you'd actually choose the second option. But we'll go ahead and leave the default at your entire enterprise and we'll choose Next. Now this is obviously going to copy some files to our server, so I'll just pause this video here and we'll return once the files have copied. Okay, so the installation is finished. We now have a terminal server with licensing installed on this domain controller, so we'll click Finish, and in one of the more rarer occurrences for Windows 2003, we're going to have to reboot our server. So again, I'll pause this video here and then we'll return once the server has rebooted. Okay, our server's been restarted and we now have terminal services installed. Now you will have to go and activate your licensing server with the Microsoft Clearinghouse, and we won't do that here, but instead check out the Winstructor videos on terminal services where we show you how to do this. Now before we go ahead and install Citrix Metaframe XP, we should go ahead and optimize our server first. So we'll click on Start and we'll right click on My Computer and then we'll select Properties. Now up here we'll select the Advanced tab. Now under our Performance heading here, we'll select the Settings button, and then we'll select the Advanced tab. Okay, at the top here under Processor Scheduling, we've got two choices. We can adjust the performance for our programs or our background services. Now, the default here is Programs. Now we don't want to select this, and the reason we don't is this optimizes system performance for applications that are run locally, such as an example of an administrator that logs onto this server and then runs an application. If we select Background Services, then this will maximize our system performance for remote users connecting to this server, which is what we want in a terminal services environment. Now down the bottom here we have the page file settings. Now as a general rule, the page file should be set to 1.5 times the amount of physical memory that you have in your server. Now this server did have 256 megabytes of RAM in it. Now you can see that 384 meg has been allocated to the paging file, which is 1.5 times 256 meg. Now we've just upgraded this server, we've now got 512 megs of RAM in it. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change this value here. Now the first thing I want to point out is that our page file currently exists on the C drive. Now if you do have any additional drives in your system, I thoroughly recommend that you move the page file to a different drive to increase your performance. Now down here we can see our initial size is set to 384 megs, our maximum size is set to 768. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this value to 768 as well. And the reason I'm going to do this is to avoid fragmentation in the page file. So make sure that these two values here are the same. We'll go down here and we'll click on OK. Then we'll select OK again to lock these settings in. Alright, now we'll choose OK once more, and now we're ready to install Citrix Metaframe XP. Okay, we've inserted our CD-ROMs at the drive and it will auto-play into the menu that you see here. So to start the installation of Citrix Metaframe XP, we'll simply click here on Install or Update Metaframe XP Server button. And then here we'll choose Metaframe XP Feature Release 3. Alright, so here we are. Welcome to the Citrix Metaframe XP wizard. So what we'll do is we'll just click Next. First thing we need to do is accept the license agreement. So we'll do that and we'll choose Next. Now we have to choose which version of Metaframe XP that we want to install, whether that be XPE, XPA or XPS. Now this will obviously depend on which version you have licensing for. We'll leave the default here at XPE and then we'll choose Next. And now we have to choose the product type, so whether it's a retail, not for resale, an evaluation or some other version, we'll leave it at retail and again we'll choose Next. Now it's time to select the components of Citrix Metaframe XP that we want to install. Now as we're going to be covering pretty much everything in these videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select the entire feature to be installed on our hard drive, and that will mean that 9 of 9 features, so everything in other words, is going to be installed on our hard drive, and that's going to require 221 megs of disk space. We can see down here that the location of the installation is going to default to our program files / Citrix directory, and look, and that's fine by me, so I'll just choose Next. And now we need to configure our server address for the Ica pass-through client. This enables the client to be installed on our server for testing client-to-server connectivity in our server farm, as well as allowing our Ica client on the server to access server resources. Now the default, as you can see here, is localhost. I'll just leave this default for the moment and then we'll click on Next. And now we're asked if we want to enable Ica pass-through authentication from the client to the server. Now pass-through authentication allows the user's logon credentials to be passed through to the Citrix server for authentication. If you select No here, then you'll have to reinstall it later if you decide you want to use this. So we'll leave the default here at Yes, and then we'll click Next. Now as our server is our first Citrix Metaframe server, we'll now choose to create a new farm. If you're already running Citrix Metaframe and you want this server to join your existing farm, you'll choose the second option. So we'll just click on Next, and then we'll need to give our new farm a name. Now this name can only have a maximum of 32 characters, so we'll just call ours here Test Company. Now the next thing we need to do is configure our data store. Now in our case, we'll just use the default Access database. But our other option here is to use a SQL Server Desktop or the MSDE database, or of course here, if you have a separate database server on another server, you could use that as well. Finally, the default zone name is simply the subnet in which our Citrix server resides. So we'll accept our default here of 192.168.0.0 and then we'll choose Next. Now we need to tell our wizard the account in which we want to install this Citrix Metaframe server. Now this account will be needed to create any additional administrators later, so if you're currently logged on as a different account, be sure to double check this here. So we'll just accept the default of administrator in our test domain and then we'll click Next. Now we can configure shadowing. Shadowing is the ability for an administrator to monitor and interact with a user's ICA session and then view everything on that screen that the remote user would see, kind of like the remote control option on terminal services. The default is to allow shadowing of ICA sessions, and that's the option we'll choose, but we can also permit shadowing of ICA sessions. We could also prohibit controlling the user's desktop, and this would just mean that an administrator can just view their desktop. We could also ask the user's permission to shadow their desktop, and we can also elect to log all of our shadowed connections to the Citrix server in the Windows event log. Now this will log all attempts to shadow a user whether they're successful or not. So we'll just leave these defaults here and then we'll click Next, and then here we can set up the XML port that Citrix listens on. The Citrix XML service supplies servers running the web interface for Metaframe XP and ICA clients the names of applications that are published on Metaframe servers. Now the default port is port 80, but if you want this information to run over SSL, then you'll want to change this port. You can do it now or later, it's up to you. But we'll leave the default port at port 80, which shares obviously a port with IIS, and then we'll choose next. Now we get an option to configure a default web page for our server. As you can see, it's going to give us the default page of server01/citrix/metaframe/xp/default.htm, and then of course users can now access this by just pointing to http server01. So if you don't want that to happen, just simply uncheck this box, but I like that, so we'll leave this feature enabled and then we'll choose next. Okay, now we're told that Setup's detected that there aren't any users in our remote desktop users group. Now Citrix need users to be added to this group in order to use Metaframe servers. Now Citrix will by default add all members of the users group into the remote desktop users group if we leave this setting here on. Now alternatively, we can choose to add all authenticated users or to skip this setting entirely. Now we also get a security note here that tells us that any user that is later added to the remote desktop users group will automatically be allowed to use ICA and RDP connections. So bear this in mind if you don't want certain users accessing your Metaframe servers. Now we'll just leave the default and we'll click next, and then we're presented with the installation summary. So if everything looks okay, click on finish, and then Citrix Metaframe XP with feature release 3 will begin installing. Now this will take a while, so we'll pause the video here and then we'll return once the installation is complete. Okay, Citrix Metaframe XP with feature release 3 has been installed. You can see we've got a couple of icons here on our desktop. Now the wizard gives us a final option of viewing a README file and then launching the ICA client distribution wizard. Now we'll uncheck both for now, and then we'll click on close, and then we'll be prompted to restart our server. Now the next thing we'll have to do is set up some licenses for Citrix before we can begin using it, and we'll do that in our next video on licensing.